Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Violence, Oppression, and Domination. Violence, oppression, and domination are all some of the most significant challenges to both human and animal rights, and more generally, to a world in which we all humans alongside non-human animals strive together. The panel will include 3 presentations, followed by a discussion and Q&A. You are welcome to write down questions and comments in the chat box during the presentations. Please write to who you are addressing your comment or question. Our first presenter for this panel is Pablo Pérez Castelló from Royal Holloway University of London. Pablo, you can begin.
Thank you very much, Limo. Let me share my screen. Can you see it correctly?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I found out 1 hour ago that I have 15 minutes instead of 20. So I will make my best, do my best not to feel that I'm rushing or anything. So I'm going to jump some parts of the presentation for that reason. So yeah, these things happen sometimes. So what I'm going to try to talk about today is intersectionality as a method of analysis. AFCO has recently argued in Racism as Zoological Witchcraft that intersectionality is quite limited as a method of analysis, he thinks, to understand different oppressions. And instead, I'm going to propose, I will endorse AFCO's critique, I will explain it as well, and then I will kind of try to propose an interconstitutional method of analysis, because I think it will allow us to understand oppressions better. So very briefly, my presentation is going to be divided in these 3 points, mainly a little bit about my background that I think will help to situate my talk today, what is intersectionality and why it's limited, and then my proposal of interconstitutionality, which is, by the way, very influenced by Clegg Kim's work. Clegg Kim says, for example, that racism and animalness are dynamically interconstituted all the way down. AFCO has said similar things. But none of them, to my knowledge at least, have articulated a different method of analysis. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, briefly at least, or at least present the idea, perhaps. So about my background, I come from a continental philosophy background. The work of Jacques Derrida and Martin Heidegger have influenced me a lot, and intersectionality as well. So fields like critical disability studies, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, ecofeminism, or critical animal studies are very central to my work. My PhD thesis is on language, and there are 2 halves. So the first one that talks of the language of zoodemocracy is very close in some respects to what Barbara King was explaining before today. My question in a way revealed that. And then the second part is on contesting human dominion over animals. And it is of this second part that I will discuss more today, specifically in relation to how I understand language and what I have come to think in my thesis in terms of what is language in a way. And in my thesis, I don't theorize language as the way that we tend to think of language. So we think often, I have here a pen, for example, we think often that we can reconceptualize concepts, right? So I have this pen here, so I can say, oh, this means the human now. So every time that I say human, you will think this human means pen, right? But that's not how I think of concepts in my thesis. What I'm trying to discuss in my thesis is that we are born into language. We are born into languages that have the human-animal distinction as a central dichotomy, that have the subject of the object dichotomy as a central dichotomy, and others like reason and so on. And it is in that sense that concepts, in a way, constitutes who we are. They constitute our subjectivities. And it is in that sense that I'm going to refer to language and concepts, if you know what I mean. I know this is a bit of a complex idea, but I'm going to discuss it at different moments as well later on in the talk. So the idea is that as my thesis unfolded, I realized that interconstitutionality was not really explaining some of the things I was finding. And I was very happy to read AFCO's book, because I was like, oh, this is more or less a lot of the concerns I had. And AFCO has now sort of articulated them, because, you know, as an intersectional scholar, I was like, what am I doing here questioning intersectionality? But eventually kind of I coincided, my findings were coinciding with AFCO's. So very quickly, intersectionality now. So what that is, Crenshaw coined this term. Crenshaw was a Black woman legal scholar. And what she was trying to say is that, look, she said, we cannot really understand oppressions as being isolated. So if we want to understand, for example, how a Black woman is oppressed, we will not be able to understand it if we think of how white women are oppressed or how black men are oppressed. We need to draw, and this is the kind of usual language that is using intersectionality, we need to look at the connections, how this gender and race overlap. And in a way, the idea is that we can, by drawing from different fields, we can illuminate the nature of our given oppression better. So that's sort of the idea of intersectionality. I'm sure that you are familiar with it, but that's more or less the general idea. And of course says, well, in truth, intersectionality still remains one-dimensional, because she says many intersectional authors, when one reads intersectional writings, they are placed in their home fields, and then they will draw from different fields and say, okay, if I need to understand something better, and say someone is situated in critical race theory, and they say, I need to understand that better some aspects of gender, they will go to gender studies or feminist literature, they will read about it, and then say, okay, now by drawing insights from here, we can understand better this oppression. But what Afko and Clegg and Kim say is that in reality, oppressions and knowledge systems do not only intersect somewhere, they are constituting each other. And I think, well, by the way, before I continue, also notice, and this is very important and relates to what Barakin was saying in part, that the grammar of intersectionality is a grammar that connotes, it evokes externality. So when two things intersect, they are external. And when two things connect, they are external. When two things overlap, they are external to each other. They do not constitute each other, at least discursively and grammatically. So this kind of grammar and discourse is not only a grammar and discourse. Sometimes when one reads intersectional literature, one sees that that method, that way of thinking is operating there. Even though, in my view, many intersectional scholars and different instances, we will see later one example of this, are using an interconstitutional method of analysis, in my opinion. But yes, so of course says that white supremacy is composed of anti-animal sentiments. Hence, in order to take down this ideology, our activism must include a robust analysis of animals within the racial landscape. And it is that within that to me is crucial, because the idea is that one cannot understand how animals are oppressed unless we think that they are already within a racial landscape. And similarly, we cannot understand the oppression of Black people unless we understand that our reality, as it were, is already animalized. Black people, Clegg and Kim and Afko have done wonderful work on this, Clegg and Kim in Dangerous Crossings as well, trying to show that, as a matter of fact, Black people are sometimes seen as animals in the sense of subhuman, as Gayatri Spivak would probably say. So that's more or less what's going on here with that critique, right? I hope that you can get a sense of what's going on, but with what I will say now, I think it's going to become clearer. So while I am with Clegg and Kim and Afko, I agree with everything they say in their work in this respect. They still, I think, even though this is a bit unfair, because they do talk of, for example, Afko in an interview says that gender is lived through race. And Clegg and Kim says somewhere as well that our existence is lived through race, that we feel, we act by being, as it were, constituted by racial categories. But most of their work is going to operate at the level of epistemology. So how different knowledge systems are constituting each other. That's really what they are after mainly, I think, in a lot of their work, at least, although not exclusively. So I was going to show that how this was operating in this quote, but by Afko, but I think it's better if I move on because I don't have as much time as I thought. So I will get to this later as well. But the example I want to look is by Laurie Gruen, really. Because Laurie Gruen, by the way, is as well one of the authors that has influenced me the most to think about interconstitutionality as a method of analysis, because in Entangled Empathy, for instance, she says that reason and emotion blend with each other, and that we are co-constituted, animals and humans, we constitute each other, that we are constituted by the entanglements that exist between humans and animals. So the language I'm using is literally Laurie Gruen's, like some of the things I'm saying are pretty much quotes, or at least I'm paraphrasing what she says. Yet she endorses an intersectional method of analysis. And so I think that while there are instances of what I would call interconstitutional thinking in her work, there are also instances in which this externality and this kind of intersecting that I think is limited in some respects also operates in her work. And this example, I think, is very illustrative of what I'm trying to get at. So she tries to, this example, by the way, is an imaginary example on animal experimentation and empathy. And it reads like this. It says, AB does neurological research on cats. She's interested in grounding some of the behaviorist hypotheses in neurophysiology developed in the 1970s. She regularly creates lesions in the brains of the cats, causing tremors, seizures, and other behavioral problems. Because anesthetics are likely to have a confounding effect on the brain, when it comes to study the brains, she removes them without anesthetizing the cats. The cats suffer terribly in this research, but AB doesn't empathize with them. They are only cats after all. Now, Lori Gruen reads this fragment in her book as follows. She says, the failure to see these harms as harms is one of willful ignorance or affected ignorance. That is, the phenomenon of choosing not to know what one can and should do. So as you can see, the stress is on willful ignorance. This is a choice that AB made, not to sort of know what one can and should do in this case, right? But what emerges from my PhD thesis, and this is very influenced by Martin Heidegger and Jacques Derrida, is that in truth, we don't make so, by the way, I want to say before I continue with this, sorry, I should have said, because I'm going a bit quicker than I should have said that I do not want to exempt in what I'm going to say now as in what follows, someone like AB from responsibility altogether. And I do not intend to make the claim that this is all social determinism or something of the sort. That's not my aim, but rather to place the emphasis somewhere else. That's what I'm going to target. So the gathering force of the logos, or the gathering force of language, really. Heidegger says that it is language rather than humans that bring various disparate things together into a unity. Read instead of unity concept. So the idea is, when we look at the world, when you are looking now at these slides and you're looking at your screen now, you are seeing a computer, you are seeing a human, and all that is kind of enfolded into concepts, into a certain conceptuality. So when AB, to bring it to AB, what this quote means in the case of AB is that when she was experimenting on the cats, she was experimenting by being constituted by dichotomies such as the subject-object dichotomy was playing a role there. It was present in that room. She was seeing the cat as a concept. She was seeing the concept of the animal in part as well. Here, the work of Jacques Derrida is very important, I think, in this respect. And so the idea of all this is that when we are born, and this is a very Heideggerian thought, when we are born into language already. We don't choose that. We don't choose to be born into a language that is structured by concepts such as the subject-object dichotomy, the human-animal dichotomy, the reason-and-reason dichotomy. All these kind of dichotomies, it's something that we don't choose, and they are still constituting us in a very fundamental way. So the question that I want to ask is, to what extent was it willful ignorance, what AB was doing? To what extent was AB making that decision? So that's more or less, I hope that you can start to see what I'm trying to get at. And also, this language, of course, is not something that comes from a vacuum. It's a historical conceptual force, I say in my thesis. So the concepts like, again, the human, the animal, woman, man, and so on, they are very influenced and kind of permeated by Christianity, the Enlightenment. There's a history behind them that makes them to be hierarchical dichotomies, as it were. And of course, a culture as well of meat eating, right? So I suppose that many of you in the audience, I'm a vegan right now, but I suppose that many of us were not vegan at some point. And that also plays a very important part in what AB was experiencing, probably when AB was looking at those cats and she was experimenting with them. It would have been interesting because it's an imaginary case to know whether AB was a meat eater or not. And I think that my point of all this is that if we think that Westerners come to be within a language, a culture, an epistemological order that forms our subjectivities to be anthropocentric, racist, sexist, ableist, and hold a position of dominion over animals, then the point is that if that's the case, it would seem to me, at least, that the language of intersectionality and the method of intersectionality in which it tries to understand how different operations overlap, which connotes, again, externality, that they are not really constituting each other, that we try to understand how knowledge systems are influencing each other or interconnected, or they intersect at a crossroads, again, that is this kind of thinking is permeating into the intersectionality as a method of analysis. If we do that, I think that we would fail to put the emphasis where I think we should put it. which is in how all these epistemologies, language, our culture, capitalism, and all other forces, as it were, how they are all constituting each other, how they are all forming each other, and how, which is what Kim and Dafko really are after, but also how they constitute our subjectivities, because we are born in this world with all this language, culture, epistemology, and so on. So that's more or less, because yes, I think my time is starting to finish. That's more or less what I wanted to explain. More. I wish I had a bit more time. Perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about this a bit more, because in my previous idea of the presentation was slightly clearer. But also here you have my contact details. If someone is interested on this, like my PhD thesis is a lot about these things. So I'm always happy to talk about these things with people. So please feel free to reach out. And thank you very much. I think I'm on time really more that we talked about this.
You're on time. Thank you, Pablo, for a very interesting talk. Our next presenter is Shegay from the Institute of Animal Law of Asia. Lu, you can start sharing your presentation.
Okay, do you see my presentation? Oh. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be part of this panel, and today I'm going to talk about the importance of recognizing animals as victims, briefly discuss the term crime victim, touch upon a couple of cases in the United States, and provide some suggestions. So in any criminal law system, victims are one of the most important parties in the criminal case. Given how many animals are suffering from cruelty against them, it is necessary to address the issue with elevating their status in the legal system. Companion animals are neglected and abused by their owners. Animals are suffering in labs. Farmed animals are cruelly treated inside the factory farms and then in slaughterhouses, and are kept in tiny enclosures with insufficient space, air, light, and generally in very unacceptable conditions. Wild animals, including those are used in entertainment, circuses, zoos, and aquariums, and so on and so forth. But anti-cruelty statutes usually apply only to companion animals, and many of the animal protection regulations do not even cover farmed animals, birds, or aquatic animals. So the definition of crime victim generally includes persons, individuals, estates, government agencies, corporations, family members, guardians, and legal representatives. Here are one of the most common definitions in the United States sources, such as Alabama Code or the Code of Delaware. Some courts refer to the dictionaries to identify the meaning of the word victim. So Black's Law Dictionary, for example, says that a victim is a person harmed by criminal acts and attack target. Merriam-Webster's dictionary says that a victim is a living being sacrificed to a deity or in the performance of a religious rite, which I will discuss more later. And Cambridge Dictionary provides that a victim is someone or something that has been hurt, damaged, or killed, or has suffered either because of the actions of someone or something else, or because of illness or chance. In the United States, in some cases, animals were recognized as victims under certain circumstances. In Oregon, there were various cases on the crimes of animal neglect, where the question before the court was whether animals can be recognized as victims. In State versus Nix, for example, the defendant owned animals on his farm, and by the time the police officers entered the property, dozens of emaciated animals, mostly horses and goats, and several animal carcasses were found there. At the trial, the court found that within the meaning of the Oregon Revised Statute, only people can be victims of the crime. But the Court of Appeals held that because of the absence of the clear definition, the legislator intended to provide the ordinary meaning of the wording. So the definition indicated in the dictionary provides that a victim is a living being sacrificed to some deity or in the performance of religious rite, the definition that was provided by the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And so from this definition, we can see that it doesn't apply only to human beings and can be referred either to human beings, animals, or both. But from the statute wording, the legislator didn't mean to refer to animals, but it can include both human and non-human animals, and nothing in the text, context, or legislative history of the statute necessarily precludes an animal from being regarded as such. The Court of Appeals concluded that animals are recognized as victims for the purpose of animal welfare statutes. And although the court in State versus Nix vacated this decision, other courts supported that conclusion and held that they were persuaded by the State versus Nix court reasoning. So we can see that there have already been some cases in certain jurisdictions with the issue of recognizing animals as crime victims, at least for the purposes of animal welfare statutes. Some courts use the ordinary meaning of the word victim and refer to dictionaries to identify the plain meaning of the word. But another problem is um, who can be victims of the crime and what categories of animals it would be easy to apply. Most statutes apply only to companion animals, but there are other categories of animals that can be considered victims too. These include farmed animals, wild animals, including those that are kept in circuses, zoos, aquariums, and so on and so forth, laboratory animals, and others. One of the most famous examples with marine mammals is Tilikum case, a captive orca who was captured in Iceland and spent most of his life in captivity and entertainment. And it was shown that he wasn't acting naturally, and animals in captivity are usually not able to act naturally. And it applies to marine mammals, wild animals used in entertainment. Um, and as a result, in most cases, animals experience extreme stress, including marine mammals, especially when they're separated from their offspring or after breeding. To elevate the status of animals and recognize them as victims of crime, it is necessary to address the concept of legal personhood for animals, because many statutes um, consider victims persons. And of course, different dictionaries may provide different wording or language. The main point of the term legal person remains the same. It is a person having rights and obligations under the law. And again, animals cannot have the same rights and obligations equally to those that humans have, but fundamental rights of animals should be given to them. For example, the European Court of Human Rights affirmed that even legal entities cannot enjoy all existing human rights. On one hand, they can enjoy freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, and others, but on the other hand, those legal entities cannot enjoy the freedom of conscience, the right not to be subjected to degrading treatment or punishment by their very nature, or the right to the respect of dignity. And same with animals, there is no established rule saying which rights should be granted to them. For example, the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, established by the World Health Organization of Animal Health, defined an animal being in a good state of welfare as being healthy, comfortable, well nourished, safe, capable of expressing innate behavior, and not suffering from pain, fear, and distress. So, the proposals to elevate the status of animals in the legal system are the following. I have 2 points with regard to this topic. So, animals are property. This is the fact that they're considered property under the law in almost every jurisdiction. But what differs from other types of property is they're living beings and they can experience feelings and emotions such as suffering, pain, happiness, fear. Today, I mostly covered farmed animals and aquatic animals due to the time limit, but we can also go beyond that. Like fish was proven to experience fear and suffering. So, my first proposal is recognizing animals as legal persons would be an important step, because this will play a significant role in the criminal process and investigations related to crimes against all categories of animals. The great example of this solution is the ongoing case, Justice versus Virtue, where the animal law organization sued the defendant on behalf of the horse who was neglected by his owner. So if basic rights are granted to animals, it would be more feasible to recognize animals as legal persons. But granting legal rights, even the fundamental rights, may take a long period of time given the process of enacting and enforcing such a rule of law. And the good thing is that there have already been some cases in some jurisdictions, and animals were recognized as victims for the purposes of merger, and that might be another starting point for those jurisdictions. And it is also necessary to know that despite most statutes defining the term victim as a person, the court decides how to interpret this word. My second suggestion is the possibility to sue either owners of some animals if they have one, or the owners of the property where animals are kept, for example, zoos or legal entities operating facilities like circuses or aquariums, like traveling circuses, for example, or agricultural operation facilities, and both individuals and countries catching and abusing aquatic animals. Uh, with with suing countries, it might be difficult because it will involve international law, and same with agricultural operation facilities. Like factory farms are usually not open to the public, and although there have been done some in undercover investigations, it is still it would still be hard to sue the facility that is not open to the public and that is protected by the law. Um, and this method, in my opinion, might be weaker than the previous one because of various reasons. Um, with factory farms, the main one of the main challenges is the economic impact because of the high demand for meat, and same with aquatic animals, with the with increasing demand for seafood. So veganism and raising awareness about it is one of the simplest ways that require no skills, and um, but it can change some people's minds and their everyday habits. I think it is still possible to sue zoos for keeping animals in unacceptable conditions and in small cages, and their feeling of distress due to unnatural habitat, um, and circuses where animals are forced to perform, and etc. So both proposed solutions require certain amendments in law, and despite the fact that animals are recognized as sentient beings and they're different from other types of property, there are still some loopholes in the legislation in any jurisdiction around the world. So the recognition of animals as crime victims would be the first and most important step in the animal rights movement. Uh, thank you.
I didn't notice I'm muted. Thank you, Lou. Our last presenter for this panel is Yossi Wolfson from Tel-Aviv University.
In this presentation, I will try to superficially outline how colonial influences were prominent causes of shifts in diets and in modes of animal exploitation in Israel-Palestine. While this is a rather narrow test case, it might be significant for animal liberation efforts elsewhere. After all, colonial situations are prominent in today's political economy worldwide. One important message I want to convey in this presentation, and hopefully to demonstrate, is the importance of historical and materialist approach to animal liberation. To understand animal oppression, one needs some theory of oppression. To envision animal liberation, one needs some theory of liberation. This presentation will assume theories that emphasize the historical and the material components of oppression. Melanie Joy created the term carnism to describe the ideology, or I would rather say the family of hegemonic ideologies that allows us to eat the meat of certain animals. She compares it to other ideologies such as racist and patriarchist ideologies. She characterizes these ideologies as violent and as invisible. They are so entrenched that it seems that they are so entrenched in society that it seems that they just represent the things as they are and as they should be. They are the normal. And Joy describes social institutions that diligently work to maintain this ideology, and specifically to maintain carnism. The classification of carnism and similarly speciesism as ideologies is important. It takes us from the sphere of philosophic debate to the sphere of social structure analysis. While Joy doesn't expand on the material basis of carnism or on the development of different carnist ideologies, there is plenty of theoretical work on social construction of ideologies. This diagram is from David Nibert's book, Animal Rights, Human Rights. It is one way to present the Marxist concept of material base and ideological superstructure. Genealogically speaking, oppressive relations come first. Laws, cultural representations, philosophies, religions are created to forcibly enforce, to reflect, and to justify these relations. They normalize oppression. Thus, they reinforce the material power relations. Ideologies develop and change based on concrete material circumstances, such as technologies of production, power relations, modes of exploitation. This is especially relevant to ideologies that are based on economic relations, and our relations as human with non-human animals are by large economic. They are by large relations of exploitation or competition. While there is a lot of literature on the history of ideas pertaining to human-animal relations, it is important to research the material history of oppression of both human and non-human animals, which underpins these ideologies. This is true to liberationist philosophies as well. These two depend on material relations of production. A liberationist counter-ideology tends to compete with hegemonic ideologies or to be incorporated into them only if material circumstances are favorable. Keeping this in mind, let's turn to the material developments in animal exploitation in Israel-Palestine. Originally, diets of the lands were mostly plant-based. This is reflected in old sources, such as biblical texts. But however, for the sake of this presentation, I will focus on two surveys from the 1930s and the 1940s. The survey from 1931 was done by Zionist researchers. The one from 1942-43 was done by the British government. Both had quite similar findings. As the British official wrote, meat, as is the custom, is eaten once a week by the property owners only. Most do not touch meat or fish at all. The author criticizes efforts of Western agencies, such as the League of Nations, to promote animal-based foods, and remarks that certainly many Arabs seem to lead strong and active life on very limited animal protein, and large populations in other parts of the world exist on almost completely vegetarian diets. Here are some numbers from these surveys. Luckily, researchers in both surveys were not satisfied with average data. They collected separate and very detailed data differentiating between ethnicities, sectors, and economic classes. 72% of Arabs lived in rural areas. Within this population, the lower numbers you can see on the first line reflect diets of those within the rural population who depended on charity, while the higher numbers on the first line reflect the diets of property owners. The second line gives the diet of inhabitants of the village of Kabal, as documented by the Zionist research in 1931. This village in the north of the country was destroyed in the Nakba in 1948, and you can see its ruins in the picture below. Urban Arabs ate more meat than the rural Arabs, and the British writer explains this as a more or less recent outside influence. In the third and fourth lines, you can see the consumption of two layers within the Arab populations with the highest expenditure on food, probably the richest. Meat consumption moved higher among Jews, especially in Zionist settlements. Compare these numbers with the current diets in Israel in the last line. Meat consumption rocketed, while consumption of legumes fell dramatically. While these numbers are an average for the whole populations, older numbers show that while in the 1930s and 40s Jews ate more meat than Arabs, today Arabs eat more meat than Jews. To complete the picture, one should add that according to FAO statistics, per capita meat consumption in Israel is dramatically higher than in neighboring countries. And again, according to FAO statistics, Israel now has one of the highest per capita meat consumption worldwide, especially chicken meat. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to fully analyze causes of this diet shift. However, it is clear that this diet shift can be attributed to Western cultural influences, to governmental efforts to promote animal-based foods, and to structural economic changes, all of which were prompted by colonialism. Production patterns changed as well. Traditional Arab food production used to be based on local agriculture and gathering. The Nakba in 1948, waves of land confiscation later on, and oppressive regulations had devastating effects on Palestinian agriculture. Communities became dependent on paid labor in Jewish-controlled industries and on food produced in the Jewish sector. Already before 1948, European immigrants, Zionist Jews, but also Templar Germans, strengthened animal-based food industries and intensified them. After 1948, legally binding quotas barred Arabs from engaging in many animal-based industries. So to date, the cow milk, chicken meat, and egg industries in Israel are virtually under Jewish ownership. And more recently, international animal food corporations did their share in influencing consumption patterns, especially since the entry of international fast food chains such as McDonald's, who opened their first branch in Israel in 1993. The high animal-based food consumption in Israel is based on imports of feed, cow and fish meat, and live animals. So while the Arab sector became dependent on the Jewish sector, both are dependent on international markets. The processes described above might raise an idea. If human colonialism enhanced animal oppression, the liberation of animals might benefit from decolonization. History, of course, cannot be rolled back, and each stage in history is built on previous ones and has its own characteristics. Nevertheless, reclaiming traditional cuisines, re-establishing traditional agriculture, and demanding food sovereignty may underpin a reduction in meat consumption and allow for liberationist ideologies, which would include humans, non-humans, and nature. To illustrate such a prospect, I chose the olive tree, both a symbol of Palestinian attachment to the land, sumud, and an industry that suffers greatly from the occupation. This, however, is not the case in Israel. In the 1990s, animal liberation groups in Israel promoted ideas and counterculture that emphasized anti-consumerism and unity of liberation struggles. This is not the case anymore, at least when one checks the dominant tendency in current vegan movements in the country. Culturally, the foods promoted are not those typical of local traditional cuisines, but novel or foreign foods. Economically, vegan movements promote consumerist lifestyles in which in many occasions depend on imports. The last for Beyond Burger is a good illustration of this. To portray this phenomenon, I checked pictures depicting vegan food in the Facebook pages of Israel's two leading vegan NGOs, Vegan Friendly and Animals Now. From December 2020 to May 20th, 2021, Vegan Friendly published 96 pictures of vegan food on their Facebook page. 69% featured dishes from foreign cuisines, mostly American dishes, or ones from other parts of the world that were well adopted in North America, such as pizza or sushi. This includes 21% of the picture which featured hamburgers. Both in the previous slide and in the next ones, notice the dominant presence of foreign and international brands. About a third of the pictures explicitly represented products of foreign or international corporations, including 6 representations of Beyond Meat. 64% of the pictures included novel ingredients. The 6% of the pictures that featured dishes identified as Middle Eastern were all meat equivalents of dishes such as shawarma or kebabs, based on novel ingredients. At the same period, Animals Now published 18 pictures depicting vegan food on their Facebook page. 39% represented dishes from foreign cuisines, including 22% which included hamburgers. 11% were of dishes connected to Jewish holidays, and the rest could not be attributed to a specific cuisine. Animals Now showed more nutritional awareness and featured more unprocessed fruits, vegetables, and legumes, almost absent in the vegan-friendly page, but many of those were not local fruits identified with local traditional cuisine. In both pages, there was not even one picture of a local Arab dish made with traditional ingredients and served in the traditional fashion. It may be argued that vegan movements are allowed to flourish specifically because of this cooptation into the global capitalist interests. For the global capital, vegan lifestyles represent promising consumerist niche. As long as we vegans do not just go to the market and buy raw legumes, grains, vegetables, and fruits to cook at home. Novel plant-based or lab-based proteins represent promising opportunity for production expansion in a period when climate change threatens the continued expansion of livestock industries. However, it may be argued that there is a price for this cooptation. Siding with colonial capitalist interests is not without effect. Veganism, and therefore animal liberation, might be identified as a lifestyle for the rich who can sustain themselves on Beyond Burgers. This is a pity because healthy vegan diets based on grains, legumes, vegetables, and fruits are relatively cheap and accessible in Israel-Palestine. Veganism, and therefore animal liberation, might also be identified as American cultural influence connected to Western expansionism. This may alienate communities which suffer under the hands of Western powers. Siding with colonial and capitalist interests might also affect ideas of animal activists themselves. After all, if people's consciousness is determined by the social reality, we can expect this cooptation to influence ideas within the vegan movements. Such influences might distance vegans from solidarity with marginalized and oppressed groups and from speaking truth to power. We might lose critical thinking and liberationist zeal. In the struggle for global justice for all animals, losing these resources is not a small price to pay. Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi. I am now happy to introduce Professor Justin Marceau from the University of Denver.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to my co-panelists for such great presentations. And, so I'll say a few things. I'm not an expert on this discussant idea, but I tried to read the papers and offer some thoughts that I think are relevant. And let me just start by saying that I completely agree with Yossi that the movement needs a theory of liberation. And one of the questions that I have posed in my research and that really comes to mind when I look at these projects is whether it's possible, right? And this is sort of what Yossi is getting at, whether it's possible to imagine that this movement, this project of protecting animals could be a project of oppression, project of violence, a project of domination. Is that inconceivable? And I think that there are lots of ways, including this sort of exporting of the Beyond Burger, which is a fascinating idea, this idea of sort of cultural imperialism through consumerism. I appreciate that. But I think there are other things that are being exported around the world and that are at risk of being adopted by the movement. Certainly it's true in Europe, and I'm less sure of the experience in Canada, and I'm less sure of the experience in Israel. But that is the American tradition of sort of carceralism and being tough on crime. And what is the relationship of that form, that style of oppression to animal protection? And if we could say that the sort of use of the Beyond Burger and this Beyond Burger veganism risks alienating the movement, I would say that sort of incarceration and tough on crime animal law goes even one step further in terms of being regressive and alienating. I would say also, and this was, I'm not sure if you'll see if I missed this point today, but he emphasized quite nicely in the paper that there's always this risk that, as you approach a problem through a certain lens, the very ideas of the movement are co-opted and sort of changed. And I think that that is definitely true in many forms. And what I have seen is that the animal protection movement has become increasingly tolerant of the idea and the discourse that says that longer sentences, more incarceration, a more carceral approach will help animals. Right? There's this sort of utopian myth that more criminal code convictions, more prosecutions will result in greater liberation for animals. It's our theory of liberation in some sense. And I would say that in this sense, it really resonated with me in looking at some of these papers. There is very much a changing of our ideas, of the animal movement's ideas, right? We have bought into this idea in many countries that we are helping animals. And I would say that the opposite is true. I would say that the investment in tough on crime policies has done more to change the animal liberation idea, what it means to be an animal advocate, than we have changed the sort of institutions of prosecution and state power. Right? We are doing more to reinforce those institutions in our own community than we are challenging them externally. And on this point, I want to just give a couple of examples and then open it for more general questions. But on this point, I did want to delicately and with respect disagree a little bit, just with a point of elaboration, really, with my co-panelist, Lou. In the first sentence of her wonderful paper, and even today, very early in her talk, she said, quote, "Victims are one of the most important parties in the criminal case." And in my experience, both as a criminal lawyer and as a lawyer doing social justice work, that's not been my experience, right? It's the narrative that the courts tell us is that the victim is the most important. But in many ways, right, cultures and practices that have actually centered the victim look very different, right? In the common law system, we have this idea that we are serving the victim if we add 30 counts or 40 counts. But in fact, the victim might not even want that. The victims may oppose it. In the US, right, we have neutral prosecutors who don't have to listen to, as she was talking about in the Oregon case, Nick, they don't have to listen to the idea for more charges or less charges. And so it's very much not about the victim. It's very much about a culture of communicating, expressing moral value through punishment. A system that centered the victim would be quite splendid. And that is where we require a bit more imagination, a bit more elaboration of what that looked like, I think. And in that, I agree quite a bit with Lou's idea that there are things like general opposition to things like ag gag laws, and their affront to transparency and truth are indeed, I think, markers of a sort of effort to decenter animals as victims, and opposing that kind of thing, I agree, is bringing respect and dignity to victims. But let me just talk about two experiences recently, relatively recently, in the US, and one, or I'll talk about one to keep it maybe short, and one sort of prop or trope that we use to justify tough on crime. I'll start with the latter. Nothing is more sacred in sort of the pushes to justify pro-prosecution and policing approaches to animal law than the so-called link, right? And you've heard of this idea that one who commits abuse or harms an animal will move on and become a human abuser. One of the most famous psychologists in the US working with the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals described the link theory in his book as, quote, an animal abusing child is, quote, a budding psychopath, right? It's this idea that we have amongst us, right? It might sound familiar for those of you who are familiar with the history of tough on crime politics, right? It has very much the same sort of discourse and narrative of the super predator language that became a driving force in incarceration in many countries, but certainly my own in the United States. And it is everywhere. It is completely ubiquitous in the discourse across, so far as I can see, certainly in Europe, in UK. It is increasingly prevalent across sub-Saharan Africa. this idea that, quote, animal cruelty is a clear predictor of future violence against people. As the National Prosecutors Association in the United States said in 2019, it is, quote, the sentinel indicator of human violence. And as the drafter of sort of national prosecution policy in the US put it in thinking about these issues, she said, I always tell the police and prosecutors, wouldn't it have been nice to stop the sexual abuser or the murderer before they did their crime by prosecuting them for animal abuse, right? There's this notion that we can detect within our ranks these super predators, these budding, dangerous youth. But of course, this has been completely debunked from the notion of the Clinton years, of these ideas of dangerous youth that were about to grow up and explode. We call them ticking time bombs. And the link is much of the same sort of folk psychology, creating moral panic. And I think the animal movement's use and deployment as a justification for oppression and domination is really quite dangerous and even a bit of a misleading trope. So to me, right, we have to be candid that there is no one size fits all predictor of animal or human violence. And in fact, when we start pathologizing kids, particularly young boys in certain communities who have done things to animals, we end up with what one social worker has called, right, the sheep in wolf's clothing. Right? We're often trying to demonize these children and say they're going to turn in, they look like harmless kids, but really they are these budding psychopaths, as Randall Lockwood said. And so I would caution that we should be a bit more careful here. And I could go through and explain why, but just to give you two basic facts, right? The first is that every meta-analysis, and I do this in my book as well, shows that even if you were to take the link quite seriously and say, yes, maybe it is a predictor of what's coming down the path. And maybe what we as animal lawyers or animal advocates should care about is future human violence because of maybe some intersectional concern of the sort that Pablo was talking about. Maybe if that was true, what would that tell us? Well, the vast majority of the studies done here show that it's more likely than not that violent criminals have not abused animals, right? Which probably sounds as a surprise. Am I making that fact up? No, right? The average rate of animal abuse, even among violent offenders in the studies across the world, is about 30%. So that means that if we used animal abuse because we wanted to predict human violence, we'd be wrong about 2 out of 3 times, right? But if you go to a legislative hearing, you wouldn't hear that, right? You would hear about the dangers to humans that are just down the road. And then second and related, right? I mean, we could go into, I'm a big fan of formal logic, so I could tell you that it's also a fallacy of the converse to say that because someone who is in prison has abused an animal, it means that people who abuse animals will ultimately commit violent crime. It's a logical fallacy, but I won't bore you with that. But what I will say is that it is quite dangerous and misleading to pretend that we would undo a cycle of violence through some sort of punitive intervention, right? So the link, even if you were to completely buy into the idea that persons who commit some acts of violence will turn towards another victim down the road, even if you thought that was true, and that there had to be some sort of victim narrative around it that justified punishing people, you'd still say, well, does incarcerating someone, does lending someone a conviction, does encumbering their life, putting them on a registry, will that sort of make them a better person, a more sensitive person? And I looked at a case where the animal organizations had advocated for the incarceration of a 16-year-old who had abused a cat. When this 16-year-old comes out of detention 18 months later, do we really think, if you step back, that the 16-year-old is suddenly going to be more compassionate, have a greater sense of empathy, be more engaged with sort of the compassion around the kitten that he hurt? It's highly unlikely, right? This is not what prisons do. They're not homes of compassion and empathy training. It's quite the opposite, right? So even taken on its own terms, I think the link as a sort of wedge or tool to get us towards carceral animal law is quite dangerous. But I'll close with just a quick anecdote, and it's only an anecdote in the sense that I think it tells us something about the line between felons and dominant practice. Because I don't think that it's just bad in the sense of oppressing humans. I actually think that the carceral animal law focus hinders animal advocacy efforts by sort of distracting and releasing, sort of acts as a release valve and disseminates some of the pressure that's building for structural reform. So in 2006, there was a firefighter in Maricopa County. Maricopa County is this rural area. Well, it's urban and rural, but it's the city of Phoenix is in Maricopa County. has a lot of rural area around it. In 2006, there was a guy named Leroy who was sort of a heroic firefighter. And he was caught at night pulling a sheep into a barn in his neighbor's house. And police were called, and Leroy was caught with his pants down and admitted in a highly drunken state that he was trying to have sex with a sheep. And as these things sometimes do happen, this became an international news story, right? Firefighter trying to have sex with a sheep, because he was well known. I'm not really sure how it happened, but it was in the UK tabloids, where this guy, his pictures all over, and he's trying to have sex with a sheep. But the real story soon became the fact that Arizona couldn't lock him up for bestiality. And say, well, how is that possible? How could we not lock up somebody for bestiality in Arizona in 2006? I mean, we were actually executing juveniles in the colonies here in 1651 for bestiality. So how could we not be putting him in prison in 2006? Well, the answer was sort of complicated, but it has to do with the fact that when we decriminalized sodomy and same-sex relationships and other things, and struck those down, we had put bestiality in the same category, so it was legalized in a bunch of states inadvertently. But upon realizing that Leroy couldn't go to prison and be a felon for life, Arizona acted swiftly. Within a matter of weeks, passed laws through both houses, and the governor signed it. And the point here is not that sort of a dramatic act could lead to law change. Of course, that's true. But the point here is really what the law did. So bestiality in Arizona, and in most states, in many countries, as I can see it, the new Canadian legislation follows, criminalizes, quote, any sexual contact with an animal. So that seems, pretty straightforward, and it does seem, to use loose language, treat animals as victims. It's not about sexual gratification. It's about doing something to an animal that apparently it doesn't want, or at least we don't know that it wants. But here's the kicker, the supposedly major victory. And this was a victory championed. One group called it the greatest victory for animals as victims of sexual violence in the history of the United States. This victory exempted all factory farming practices. And you might say, well, of course, factory farming does not include bestiality, Justin, but then you would be wrong, right? So if I was to pull it up, I was going to put a slide. I don't usually do slides, but this slide I thought was almost worth it. But Colorado State University is the hub in the United States of factory farming practice, lots of agricultural practices through Temple Grandin come out of there. And there's a device, I don't know if you know this, for creating dairy, but it's called the artificial vagina. And it's the preferred method in the United States, at least, of extracting semen from bulls. It is quite sexual, in fact, and there is no question that it would be considered bestiality, as would the insemination, but for this massive carve out for what we might call corporate bestiality or legal bestiality in the country, right? So my point here is, well, I could say a lot more about that, right? If you've watched the undercover footage of the insemination process, an animal justice video released just within the last 6 months shows pigs being inseminated in Canada, and the men doing so use explicitly gendered language and talking about whether she wants it. There's no real question about the sort of sexual connotations of what's happening. Right? There's a practice in the textbooks of mounting. One ethnographer, Katie Gillespie, notes that the chapter on artificial insemination is called, quote, courtship, unironically. So we have here, sort of a pretty vivid line of sexual contact. And yet my point is to note that the line between felon and farmer is not nearly as great as we imagine, right? That it's somewhat arbitrary. And this was pushed by the animal movement, one of the most well-funded projects groups in the United States, to create this very line, right? So now we have a line where a single drunken act puts you on the sexual offender registry for life, but doing so thousands and thousands of times for profit, for corporate profit, is actually probably grounds to get you elected to Congress or something, right? So I'll close there, but just noting that the process of defining who is in and who is out, who is a victim, who's not a victim, who's a felon, who's a farmer, what is oppression and what's not oppression, is, I think, much less clear than we imagined in this context.
Thank you, Justin, for your wonderful insights. We can now turn to questions from the audience. And if any of you would like to ask a question, you can write it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand button. And in the meantime, if any of the presenters would like to relate to what Justin said.
I mean, and if there's not an immediate question, I mean, oh, go ahead. Let's just see a hand.
Okay, Daphne?
Sorry.
Daphne, you can unmute the ASCII 2021 and talk from there. Okay. Okay, so Michal?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I want to ask you a question, Pablo. So I really identify with what you say regarding the, critique regarding the intersectionality discourse. But I want to ask you if you can clarify your exactly critique about it, because your critique relates to the comparison, to the apparently overlap between different kinds of oppression, or does your critique relates to the result of this comparison? Because at least when it comes to people which identify their political identity with liberal secular ideas, it kind of seems to work.
To be honest, I have not thought about your question, the last part of your question, very carefully. But it's a very interesting question, I think. What I can say is about the first half, perhaps explain a bit more why I think the discourse of overlapping or analyzing oppression in that way is not going to work. And the idea is that, I think we could focus on epistemology, but as I said, because it's what is central in my thesis, really, the question of subjectivity. So if we think about intersectionality in terms of understanding why, for instance, in the case of AB, in the example I gave, or Lori Gruen gives instead, why is it that when AB is looking at those cats and kind of doing research with them, that they suffer terribly, that it's horrible? How come that nothing happens? This also is very related to the question of abattoirs that the walls were made of glass, right? That kind of idea of visibility. So how come that so many people, for example, in Australia, 25% of the population, they fish for recreational purposes, and we are in the hands, the fish are dying literally on the hands of people. So what's going on there subjectively? That's what interests me. And what I think happens when one uses an intersectional method of analysis is that one cannot really get to understand that how we are constituted by, say, the human-animal distinction, subject-object, Western epistemologies that are structurally racial and sexist and so on. So what I think happens often with intersectional scholarship is that the questions that are being asked, in my opinion, do not address that kind of question of how we are formed, how we are shaped, so that even if the walls of abattoirs were made of glass, perhaps nothing much would change. We had gladiators and that kind of thing, right? In Spain, I'm from Spain, bullfighting is broadcasted on TV, and people go to it. And so that kind of phenomenon is very important that we understand it. And what I was trying to say, and what AFCO is trying to say, is that by putting the emphasis on intersectionality, which connotes externality, different oppressions connect somewhere, they influence each other, they are interconnected, something like that. It's not getting at the root of the problem that, in my view, is that what we should be asking is, how come that we don't see that violence as violence? Here, Judith Butler's work as well is very important, in my opinion, on grievability and recognizing others as vulnerable beings, that kind of idea. I hope that can answer the first half of your question. About the second half, that is what you were truly interested in. It's something that I need to think of more carefully, but perhaps we could chat about this more carefully in another occasion. I would be very interested in that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Interesting.
Daphne?
Let's see if it works. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all very much. I think it was a really, really interesting and thought-provoking panel. I would like to expand, Justin, on what you talked about with regards to bestiality. And I think it's important to think about what these laws are trying to do, because we are allowed to do all kinds of sexual things to animals, not only in farming, but also personally, for example, to neuter and spay them. And we're allowed to touch them in ways that they might feel are sexual, even if we don't necessarily feel that way about it. I just want to mention that I have a part of my research deals with zoophilia and bestiality. And if we take that a little bit further and we think about laws, let's say in Massachusetts, where you can get up to 20 years for bestiality, then it's not about the animal, okay? It's not about caring about the animal, because we can do all kinds of things to animals that are really, really horrible and horrendous, and we don't get to sit in prison for 20 years for doing that. I think it's more about what it says about being human, okay? What we don't want human beings to do and what lines we don't want them to cross, than it is about seeing the animal as a sexual victim, because animals don't give consent to most things we do to them.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point, Daphne, and I completely agree. I think it's about defining the human more than it is about protecting the animal. I think that's spot on, and that's the way I view it. And so then the question is just, well, there's many questions that flow from that, of course, and I'd be interested in seeing your research on it. But I mean, to me, immediately, right, you have these possibilities of 20-year sentences, you have other things. The question is, what work does that do towards the animal as victim narrative, right? I mean, what does it do? Does it help? Does it have an expressive function that is a net positive? I mean, I've done some research that I haven't published yet, showing that, you know, somewhat surprisingly, maybe, well, not surprisingly to me or criminologists, but you know, rates of bestiality in these states with the highest penalties, rates of cruelty in the states with the highest penalties is not lower. Right, so you could have Massachusetts next to Connecticut that has a half or a third of the penalty, and bestiality is not higher or lower depending on the penalty. So yeah, it's a great point.
If I can comment a little about that, I think that laws such as the bestiality law and also high punishments for animal abuse are very much promoting the separation of animals. It also relates to another question on the chat between farmed animals and farming practices and other practices, and actually legitimizing the oppression of animals. And this dichotomy is a very big problem. And in thinking about that, reforms in animal agriculture, which are tend to get a lot of opposition now in the movement, at least not doing this dichotomy. And at least if we talk about liberation theory, at least they are according to what we believe in. We believe in animal interests, in fighting animal suffering, and not in appreciating animal cognition. So all these tracks of action are bringing us away from what we really believe in, which is trying to promote happiness and so on. And in Justin's book, one of the things that was very important for me to read is that in many cases, making penalties higher for animal abuse came together with common agricultural practice clauses, and with lawyers from the animal movement not defending animal liberation activists. So it's a track that really puts us off track.
Thank you, Yossi. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Oh, I see there is one in the chat, I think.
Yes, hi. Did
Yeah.
you just unmute me? Is it okay if I speak?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have a question for Lou. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So because in the chat you replied saying that the problem of animal exploitation and everything related to that this could be achieved by eliminating speciesism. And I suppose that we definitely all agree with you there. Like the best thing for the animals would be to eliminate speciesism. And that's certainly the challenge that we are sort of all working on, like how to go about this. And now I would be very curious, in addition to what you said in your talk already, from a legal perspective, what do you think would be strategies or legal measures that could be taken to achieve this, to reduce speciesism?
Thanks so much for your question. That's a very interesting one. I would say that there are a lot of aspects from the legal point of view. Like there might be a law, but another problem might be present, like the law might not be enforced. And it all depends on like what country you're located in and where you're advocating for animals. And I would say that the best starting point would be not really legal side, but policy or education, like raising awareness. I think especially where animal law is weak or non-existent, it's better to educate the public and let them know why it's important, why we're doing these things and what it can lead to. So, and then I think from that point we can come to legal side of this issues. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. So you would say that the public opinion needs to change first for laws to adapt to that.
Yeah, exactly. Because after that, the public will just demand from the government to enact some laws and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much.
Limor, could I say something about this?
Yeah,
because
sure.
it relates as well to the comment on the chat, and the issue of speciesism is also quite central in my thesis. And on this, I'm very influenced by Matthew Calarco. And what he has argued is that in truth, and perhaps it's a bit controversial, but I think I agree with him, that speciesism, he says, has never really been the problem. The problem has been anthropocentrism. So when we look at our history, humans have traditionally not discriminated beings by virtue of their species. They have discriminated those that deviated from the ideal of the human. So we have, and we still do, discriminated people that are disabled, people who are not white, women, and so on. And this still happens now. For example, in Australia, people can be discriminated. They can be taken the right to vote by virtue of being from a non-white race. In Australia also, for example, people with disabilities can be denied their right to vote. And the question that was addressed was asking as well, how come that we discriminate or that we do a lot of violence, let's say, or legitimize violence against certain animals and not others, like companion animals as opposed to, say, factory farmed animals, right? So there is this wonderful article, Misha Deka discusses it in her new book, Animals as Legal Beings, by Andrea Zevnik on Guantanamo. And one of the things she's discussing, then perhaps, Justin, I think you probably are interested in this, is that the Guantanamo prisoners were asking to have the rights that dogs had, because they didn't have a right to shelter. They didn't have a right to eat food properly, kind of thing that dogs did have. So the thing is, discrimination, when we look at it carefully, it does not really focus as much, even though it's counterintuitive, on a species. The key is the ideal of the human as an able-bodied man who is rational, white, imperialist, and so on. That's the key point, really, of discrimination historically, and also in the present, if we look at it carefully. We could look at rape culture, for example. 25% of women in the States suffer of sexual harassment or rape, for instance. So that's the kind of thing, really, that I think, and Carol Adams' work, for example, wonderful on these kind of ideas as well, the sexual politics of meat, and we could look at a lot of other things. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because in my view, at least, speciesism is not really what we should focus. I think it's more anthropocentrism, this idea of the human is really what underlies most of the oppressions, I think. And, yeah.
Thank you, Pablo. Unfortunately, we're running out of time and need to move to the last part of the day. I'm writing in the chat my email address for anyone who would like to continue the discussion, and I will pass your comments on to the participants. Thanks again to all the presenters for fascinating talks and enlightening discussion. And please stay with us for the last time slot of this evening, challenges, expressions, and impressions.